we're going to analyze a standard, and this is part of a larger training where we deconstruct standards, but we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of this standard as we go through the training today. So I've chosen 5NFA1 as the standard that we will look for and deconstruct. In beginning this, you'll need your handouts on pages 1 and 2. The language of the standard is the first thing you're going to want to look at. And here we are adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. And you can add in there by replacing given fractions with equivalent fractions and so forth. When it asks us the domain, that is the first coding after the number 5, showing 5th grade numbers and fractions of operations. Or actually numbers and operations fractions. The cluster heading is the second piece of coding, and that's A, use equivalent fractions as a strategy to add and subtract fractions. So we have our domain, numbers and operations fractions. We've got our cluster, which is the title header for a group of standards. And now we're going to move into our companion document. Our companion document, which can be accessed by the link on page 1 of your handout or with the directions given there as well, comes from LDOE. So I'm going to tell you that I already kind of breezed past the introduction pages and got to the domain of numbers and operations of fractions. I came to our cluster A, use equivalent fractions as a strategy. And you'll notice a little bit more here around some vocabulary terms in this cluster, and you'll see the actual standard here on the left. The rest of this piece gives us more information about that specific standard. And you're going to take some time to kind of read through this and make notes of the key learning for this standard. So as you read, you probably found that students are now applying their understanding that they developed in 4th grade around rewriting fractions in equivalent form and finding common denominators. They're also going to use some visual fractions to help them reason about common denominators before we use an algorithm. We can also look for strategies called for by this standard. One of those strategies we will find in here is the like denominators or common denominators. And we may also use area models as seen here. Just note that while multiplying denominators will always give us a common denominator, that may not result in the smallest denominator. So that's a note listed down here for you as the teacher that you may choose to share with your students. Some prerequisite skills or previous standards are found here, and we can actually click on this in a hyperlink, which would take us down to the 4th grade NFA1 and NFB3. But you'll find that that tells us why a fraction is equivalent to another fraction, some foundational understandings around fraction models, the addition and subtraction of fractions with like denominators, decomposing a fraction into a sum of unit fractions, knowing how to add and subtract mixed numbers with like denominators, and also solving word problems that involves addition and subtraction of fractions with like denominators. The last piece of deconstructing this standard is looking at the component of rigor. And although we are focused in on conceptual understanding with this, we do know that students were brought about with this initial understanding in 4th grade, so they're going to start to begin to make it a little more automatic into that procedural skill and fluency. So in step 1 of our 3-step process, we're going to review the standards on our end of the year rubric. You'll notice that I have scrolled down to items 12, 13, and 14 because they are aligned to that standard we just deconstructed, 5NFA1. You'll also notice in Illuminate, if you have your matrix pulled up, that those items are actually 15, 16, and 17. So please be aware of that as we continue through this process. We are looking at 5th grade, and our focus for the 10 days of instruction this summer are around the numbers and fractions, or numbers and operations of fractions, and also geometry. So although geometry is considered an additional domain, we're actually going to focus in our efforts there because it connects to the major work of 6th grade. So when we look at item 12, we see 5NFA1 as our standard, and you see that link that is embedded. That's the Achieve the Core Coherence Map. I can pull that up and look to see that we have quite a few standards as prerequisites, and then quite a few standards that are coming up that are major work of 5th grade, but also 6th and 7th grade. So that's why we really want to focus our efforts in that major cluster and domain of the numbers and operations of fractions. Just keep in mind the geometry domain is an additional domain. It is not major work of 5th grade, but we want to focus in our efforts because as we can see here, if I go into geometry, if I were to map the standard for 5GA1, you can see that it does heavily connect to 6th grade standards, including major work and supporting work. Step 2 is reviewing the data. So here I've actually pulled a matrix report from Illuminate of some 5th grade Caddo students. This is not any data that is related to one teacher. I pulled the first 20 students at a specific campus, and I pulled items 15, 16, and 17, which we know on paper are 12, 13, and 14. So again, keep that in mind as we review this data. This is actual data, and the first thing we want to do is go through this first item, and anyone who is red and has this as an incorrect item, we're going to place them right here as a note that they need acceleration. So I'm going to put my student AA, RA, JA, OA, and CC over here. I'm going to skip FC because he or she got that item correct. And then I'm going to add the rest of my students who have this in red: JG, LG, BG, KO, AS, ST, JT, and ZT. So you'll notice as a broad piece of data, we had 13 of those 20 students that need acceleration with this item. Let's look at, we're going to skip this second item because it's in the measurement and data domain, and we're not really focusing in on that area for our 10 days of instruction. But if you think that that's something you want to look at because all 20 students missed it, please feel free to go ahead and accelerate that item. But we're going to look at the next item, item 14 on paper and 17 in Illuminate, because that does bring us into that major domain of numbers and operations of fractions. And anyone who has red here, we're going to put their names right there in that box. AA, RA, JA, CC, FC, JG, LG, DH, DJ, SK, RM, BM, KOAS, ST, and JT. That shows us that 16 of 20 of these students actually missed that item. And out of both of those items that we dissected, 16 of 20 need acceleration on both items. So I have a large group concern here. And again, this is not one teacher, but this is one campus. So I would really look at what is happening. Did we even get to those standards in instruction? And we'll look more deeply into what these students are doing and what they gave us later in this training. In identifying the need, we need to go back to that standard. We deconstructed this standard 5NFA1 earlier in the training. If you don't remember, go back to page 1 and 2 of your handout. The component of rigor aligned with this item was actually conceptual understanding and procedural skill. So when we look at the item that is aligned to this standard, it says, what is 4/5 minus 1/3? We're still probably really going to focus in that conceptual understanding when we're looking at student work. Continuing to identify the need, we're looking at some student work here. Remember, we're looking at what is 4/5 minus 1/3. This student identified 3 halves. We know this is not correct because all they did was subtract across the numerator and across the denominator. So we probably need to go back to some pictorial work with this student and actually giving them a whole with an area model of 4/5 and going back to show them how to subtract that 1/3 or subtraction of fractions. We looked at some standards, we've looked at some student work. Now it's time to map our focus for the 10 days of July instruction. For those of you not working the summer intensive program, use this time to plan your first 2 weeks of acceleration. You know where you're starting in Mission 1 and what standards are heavily focused on within Mission 1. So look at some of those prereq standards and just kind of use 1 to 2 standards per week as your focus. However, for our summer intensive program, I'm going to get as much in as I can. So I actually started in the geometry domain in grade 5 Mission 6. That's where our students ended. So I want to start with that first day of acceleration. Then I'm going to go back and look at some of those numbers and operational fractions standards while pushing one of them all the way through those 4 days. Probably it's around word problems, but I can't remember right now. However, I did find that grade 5 Mission 2 really helps with all of these standards. And then in the second week, moving into Missions 3 and 4, using those number and operation of fractions standards again. So LDOE put out some Accelerate materials that all aligned with Eureka Math, which we know is aligned to our zone curriculum. These were pushed out in the spring of 21. However, many of these materials are being reworked, revamped, and made sure to be prepared for you and ready by the beginning of the school year. So you're not going to see some of your first missions in this bank, but if you look on page, I believe it is page 7 of your handout, there is a link there that takes you to all of the Accelerate materials and a guide for the Desmos Activities account setup. But I want to give you a quick tour of what this is. It says that this is to be used with Module 6, and then you're given these lessons. Module 6 is at that geometry domain. So this is only one session. When we get to Module 6, I'm going to use this session around lessons 1 through 3 the week before I present these sessions during our core time. That gives my students who have been struggling with these standards or the previous grade level standards time to prepare before core instruction. You'll see there's some notes here for you as the tutor, the teacher, but this is kind of your intervention time so you don't have to go looking for any more materials. It gives you the vocabulary. You can see here what's missing are the standards, and that's why LDOE has pulled in teachers to review these materials and refine them before the beginning of school year, but you can use these this summer with no problem. If there are extra links, they will be embedded in here for virtual manipulatives and Desmos activities. But you'll notice that your materials in your session are very similar to what you've taught previously in 5th grade math. Some of it will have some 4th grade material, but all of this is made and done for you. So you can present this whole group as a scaffold or within a small group, one-to-one devices. So Desmos is a platform free to us. Remember, on page 7 of your handout, there's a guide that you can click on that will bring you to how to set up your Desmos account. What I found is that when I clicked on the link for the Desmos activity, it asked me to sign in with my Google credentials and created me an account automatically. But LDOE has created some slides that are very similar to those Nearpod open-ended questions and draw it features. So we can click on any of these slides and the student can actually write on the slide in real time. You'll see what they're giving you, just like the Nearpod, and then we can move on. Sorry, this is not actually an interactive board. But as the teacher, I would see Amanda scribbling, so let's go back and give her a little bit more acceleration. All of these slides are already in here. You can see that some of it looks very similar to the problem sets and extra homework, and that's because the people who made these resources just clipped that into a slide for us to use so that students can actually show their work here if they're looking to create something. So Desmos is just another tool. They're already created for you, so you don't have to create those extra Nearpods. So as we get all of the resources in our hands, we wonder, well, what are we gonna do? How do we actually use all of this information? Let's go back to the time where we mapped out our 10 days for the summer intensive program. And again, during the school year, you would be using 1 standard or 2 standards for your acceleration week. I'm looking at 5GA1. I go to my scope and sequence document and I find where that is listed on the year at a glance tab. And I see it's towards the end of our 9 weeks, or actually the end of the year. So I'm gonna go into the 4th 9 weeks, week 31, and I find my standard. I'll see the mission and lessons aligned with Zern that I can pull in for that instruction. I also see additional notes. Again, remember our scope and sequence document has everything we need there for us. There are also going to be links to any Accelerate materials that are already available to us. Also, Khan Academy links or illustrative mathematics items that we can bring in to use. And for those enrichment activities, we still provide the Nearpods. So you have an opportunity to pull what resources you want to use during this summer intensive program, all there for you laid out.